Panic, dread, terror, all emotions that are regarded as unpleasant, and yet these emotions, when tied to the genre of horror, keep millions coming back for more, scare after scare. Why is that? What about horror makes it so appealing to certain people, and how come some people don't like horror at all? Hey YouTube, Wyatt here, and today, Aidan and I are going to attempt to break down why horror is such a popular genre. To do that, we first need to delve into the history of this genre. Horror as a concept dates back further than recorded history, but the first widely accepted horror piece produced was Horace Walpole's story Castle of Otranto, which wasn't so much horror as it was a gothic story. After Walpole, themes arose, particularly the haunted castle and descent into madness became very popular, still showing themselves in modern horror today. Movies gained traction as technology evolved, and in the 1930s, horror entered a golden age, with the popular Frankenstein and Dracula being adapted into movies from their book counterparts. In the years following, movies stopped focusing on gothic medieval source material and looked to the future. Science fiction horror emerged with zombies and aliens on all sorts of space travel flooding the horror scene. Movies like Independence Day fall into this sort of category. Movies then learned that if they wanted to get across the emotion fear, they could shortcut to the emotion shock. This created the era of shock horror so prevalent in the 1970s. Shock horror used disturbing images to surprise and scare the audience. Then, movies moved towards psychological horror and political messages with films like Purge. As technology evolved further, horror video games were possible. Some of the first horror video games spiked the popularity of horror as the audience, or player in this case, were finally able to be held accountable. You couldn't just say, I wouldn't have done that, and then move on. You get immersed. Something interesting about horror games as a genre is that it seems to have split into two sections early on, and they developed almost independently from each other. You have, of course, the action horror games like Doom and Resident Evil, which are primarily focused on fighting monsters, with a strict storyline you have to follow to progress the game. But then you have the survival games. These games focus on maximizing how scared you get. These games include the likeness of Subnautica and The Forest. They have the advantage of easy and believable immersion, which we'll talk about later, while also having a dire sense of life and death. In all of these games, it is 100% the player's actions that get them in and out of trouble, which makes you not want to do the wrong thing and end up dead. And even today, the genre of horror is ever changing. Horror's adaptability is one of its strongest qualities, evolving over time or changing based on location. In the West, horror films leaned predominantly towards action and combat, while in the East, they were often far more mysterious and allowed the audience to come up with their own endings. But the media itself means nothing if there was no one to enjoy it, and that's where you come in. The audience is the main thing that dictates how horror evolves and changes. If people stopped enjoying horror, then people would stop producing horror. But as the genre evolves, and more media gets produced, people keep coming back. Which is strange, isn't it? Something so dead set on making you feel scared can gather such a loyal following. Why are people so drawn to horror? You might have guessed, but it has something to do with adrenaline. Adrenaline is a neurotransmitter that increases reaction time, increases alertness, and increases concentration. It's built up by the constant tension of the plot that is so intrinsically tied to horror. This makes your brain feel as though it's actually in danger, even though the danger isn't real. This adrenaline rush is also what is present in activities like bungee jumping and skydiving, obviously to a bit higher of a degree. The point is that horror and psychology are linked quite closely, and when we asked a psychology professional, Wendy Cope, she agreed that psychology had an important role to play in horror, stating, I thoroughly enjoyed the horror genre, and at this point in my life, the most appealing part of it is the psychology. She had also some interesting points to make about who would enjoy horror, noting that anxious people may be triggered by horror, less neurotic, more thrill-seeking people enjoy horror. She made a point that immersion was important in horror, just as it is in any other media, because the more immersed you are in viewing, the better experience you're going to have. The thing about immersion is that it is almost necessary for a horror experience. If you don't believe that there's any merit to the horror, then why would you be scared? Because of this, many tools and techniques are often used to keep your immersion alive, and pull you deeper into the experience. Some of these tools include ambience, visual aspects, perception, and limiting information, and audio. Let's start with ambience. Ambience is all about what you think of the location you're in. If you think the place you're in, be it a pizza parlor or an abandoned factory, is scary, then you're more likely to get scared. Game designers and movie writers use ambience to create a sense of unease to prepare you for what you're about to soon encounter. Next up is visuals. Visuals are anything that you can see, such as a monster looking grotesque or someone missing an eye. There really is no limit to what you can accomplish with visuals. There are, however, limits to perspective. It's not as widely used as the rest of these tools, but switching the perspective of the viewer or player can be an incredibly interesting tool. If you're being watched, you might get a glimpse of the perspective of the creature that is watching you. Perspective is also one of the reasons it's so easy to establish stakes and immerse the players in a survival game. In the game, you are viewing the world from the perspective of someone in danger. This makes you feel like you are in danger as well. You could even use perception to avoid showing the monster, leaving the mystery unsolved or the tension unresolved. Which leads into the next tool, limiting information. One of the scariest things that humans can fathom is that which we do not know, especially in an environment where you're able to grasp that something is after you, but you are not able to discern what it is. This tool is employed by many games and movies, even being a staple theme in the Lovecraftian stories. The undefined regulations of having no clue what is going on in a dire situation is something that will certainly cause fear. This brings us to our final tool, audio. Audio is interesting because being one of the two most important senses of horror experience, the other being sight, it carries a large influence over the experience of the viewer. It is often used to craft ambience, establish motifs, drive plot, and interestingly enough, in a horror environment, audio can be used most effectively when it's stripped away from you.
Audio is extremely useful. It really doesn't take too much to make the mind wander. Just a slight clue makes us envision the worst scenario. Every instance of exemplary horror has one common aspect: exceedingly interesting sound design. But what makes good sound design? What works, and what just doesn't seem to hit its mark? Most sound design has a goal, especially when it comes to the horror genre. Be it to confuse, disorient, or just to make your skin crawl when you hear it, a good soundscape has purpose. One of the most instantly effective and recognizable aspects of sound design is found in a large amount of the horror genre. Loud jump scares and stingers yield instant results. They tend to be non-diegetic, which means they don't originate from the fictional world, yet they pull you in. Like a slap to the face, or rather the ears, stingers immediately let the viewer know that something important just happened on screen, while it also startles them. Paired with sudden visuals, they are very effective, but after long enough, the viewer accepts these sudden startles as part of the world, and they can no longer abuse the element of surprise. Much like faces, sound can land itself in a sort of uncanny valley. Very similarly to the actual uncanny valley, this is most noticeable in effects that are vaguely natural. An instrument like the theremin is an amazing example. While it has a very nice tone, it also isn't very pleasant to listen to. Our ears are so used to listening to the equal temperament tuning system that nearly every Western musician employs that when the theremin plays frequencies beyond two accepted tones, it just isn't right. More on that later. Detrimental audio is exclusive to horror. Meant to confuse as a sort of audio red herring, these clues hold no real meaning to the viewer in our fictional world. But they don't know that. Unnatural audio falls into this category, but it isn't completely dominated by it. Red herrings need to be convincing enough to sound like there's a helpful meaning behind them, but there really isn't one. Silence can be one of the most effective ways of scaring a viewer. After a while, the viewer becomes used to whatever oppressive atmosphere that was provided to them. While it isn't ideal, it's one of the only things given to them so that they can discern something from it to help them. Taking away all of that releases some stress, but builds an insane amount of tension as the viewer prepares for the reason the sound is cut out. But why does this all work? Why would I want to use audio over something visual? The fear of the unknown plays a large role in audio's effectiveness. It's here where we have to draw a difference between terror and horror. Terror is fear through anticipation, while horror is the fear of what you can see. There's a great text demonstrating the fear of the unknown. W. W. Jacobs' The Monkey Paw follows the pretty classic moral of be careful what you wish for, but it varies in its delivery. It follows a simple narrative. A man finds a magic monkey paw that grants three wishes. He wishes for $200, expecting it to be made from thin air, but it isn't. The next day, his son dies at work, and the man is paid $200 in compensation. Grieving, the man wishes that his son was alive again. Something knocks on the door late that night, and the man, remembering the malicious nature of the paw, wishes for whatever is behind the door to disappear. As you can see, all it takes is enough context for this type of fear to be realized in full. It seems like a lot, but I wasn't quite satisfied with all of that, so I contacted popular horror creator Postra about his views on horror for guidance. He agreed with us, stating that audio is the most impactful element of horror. It can make or break a scene or visual based purely on how effectively it's used, and make something that wasn't originally scary terrifying in the right context. And he elaborated, sharing that silence can be just as effective, if not more effective in horror, than using some kind of scary audio, and that good ambience can give a sense of danger when none is visually present. He believes that people are often drawn to horror for very different reasons, one of them being the thrill of experiencing something you don't normally get to see on a day-to-day basis. This thrill is able to be targeted and enjoyed through a good amount of control over the media. You could turn off the TV, you could close your eyes, you could quit the game. In Subnautica, everything's very intimidating, but you can always run back to your submarine. And in FNAF, you can close the doors and turn on the lights, etc. Notice how all of these examples could originate and completely inhabit the game world. This loops back to immersion. The key of effective horror is a balanced amount of control in both the hands of the viewer and the environment, and for fictional worlds to be as realized as possible. Audio is the most subtle part of this, yet we're so used to just hearing things every day that it ends up being a hugely important part of the experience.
So what draws people to horror? Chemically, the adrenaline released by the brain brings enjoyers back time and time again. But mentally, the atmosphere, and purely how unique the genre is the main reason. Horror is popular for the same reason other fictitious media is popular: to give you an escape from reality.